One of the most unusual developments in the Nancy Guthrie investigation did not begin with a witness, a surveillance video, or a newly discovered document. It reportedly began with a tip. Not just any tip, but one claiming that Nancy's remains could be located hundreds of miles away from where the case originally unfolded. The information was serious enough that authorities reportedly took notice, yet almost immediately, the tip created a contradiction that investigators could not ignore. If Nancy had been transported to Mexico, when could that have happened? Who would have had the opportunity? And perhaps most importantly, what evidence existed beyond the anonymous claim itself? For years, the Nancy Guthrie case has generated theories, speculation, and countless attempts to explain what happened. Many of those theories have come and gone without producing meaningful results. Investigators have repeatedly emphasized that evidence, not rumors, is what moves a case forward. That is why the reported Mexico tip attracted so much attention. It was not because authorities suddenly had answers, it was because the information appeared specific enough to warrant examination. According to reports, the tip alleged that Nancy's remains might be located somewhere in Mexico. Authorities have not publicly confirmed the exact source of the information, nor have they disclosed every detail provided by the caller or informant. That lack of public information is not unusual. In many investigations, law enforcement withholds certain details while attempting to verify whether a lead has any credibility. Viewed in isolation, an anonymous tip means very little. Investigators receive tips constantly. Some are honest attempts to help. Others are misunderstandings. Some are entirely fabricated. What matters is whether the information can be supported by evidence. That detail matters, because the Nancy Guthrie investigation has already accumulated years of evidence, witness statements, timelines, and reported observations. Any new claim must fit within that framework. If it does not, investigators often set it aside. If it does fit, however, it can become an important lead. Reports indicate that local authorities began reviewing the information connected to the Mexico claim. Public discussions surrounding the case quickly intensified. Online communities debated whether the tip represented a genuine breakthrough or simply another dead end. But something doesn't fit. The tip reportedly suggested a location far removed from the center of the original investigation. Such a scenario would require significant movement after Nancy's disappearance. Investigators would need to examine not only whether the location itself had any connection to Nancy, but also whether anyone associated with the case had ties to the area. That is where timelines become important. Every major investigation depends on understanding who was where and when. Small inconsistencies often reveal larger patterns. Investigators routinely compare phone records, travel records, witness accounts, financial activity, and surveillance footage to determine whether a theory aligns with documented events. According to publicly discussed information, one challenge facing investigators has always been reconstructing Nancy's final known movements with certainty. Various reports have attempted to piece together those final hours, but unanswered questions remain. Now consider this. If authorities genuinely believed the Mexico tip had potential value, they would likely compare it against information already collected during the investigation. That process involves more than simply searching a location. Investigators must determine whether the tip contains details that were not publicly known. In many cases, the strongest tips are not the most dramatic ones. They are the ones that include information only someone with direct knowledge could provide. The exact contents of the tip have not been publicly released. Authorities have not confirmed whether it included names, dates, locations, or other specifics. That uncertainty has led to widespread speculation. Yet speculation alone does not move an investigation forward. What does matter is how law enforcement responds. Reports indicate that officials treated the information seriously enough to evaluate it rather than immediately dismissing it. For observers following the case, that response attracted attention. Experienced investigators generally have little interest in wasting resources on information that lacks any possibility of verification. At first glance, that may not seem important, but when placed beside the timeline of the case, it becomes more significant. Authorities have spent years examining leads connected to Nancy's disappearance. Every decision regarding resources reflects an assessment of potential value. Then, something happened. Discussion surrounding the tip reportedly expanded beyond the original claim itself. Attention shifted toward possible connections that could explain how such information emerged. Some observers wondered whether the source might have personal knowledge of individuals connected to the investigation. Others suggested the information could have originated from secondhand accounts or rumors that circulated privately before reaching authorities. Investigators, however, generally focus on something much simpler. Can the information be verified? That question often determines whether a lead survives beyond its initial review. Court records in other missing person investigations have shown that anonymous tips occasionally lead investigators to significant discoveries. Just as often, they lead nowhere. The challenge is distinguishing between coincidence and genuine knowledge, which raises another question. Why did this tip emerge now? Cases that remain unresolved for extended periods frequently experience sudden bursts of activity. Witnesses come forward years later. Relationships change. People who once remained silent decide to speak. New technologies reveal information that was previously unavailable. Sometimes a person carrying information for years eventually decides to share it. Investigators understand this pattern well. But something else deserves attention. The reported response from officials suggested they were interested in understanding not only the claim itself, but also the credibility of the source. In many investigations, evaluating the messenger becomes almost as important as evaluating the message. If a source has direct knowledge, investigators attempt to determine how that knowledge was obtained. If a source repeats information heard from someone else, investigators try to identify the original origin. Every layer matters. As authorities reportedly continued examining the Mexico lead, observers were left with a difficult reality. The tip had generated new attention, but attention is not evidence. A reported location is not proof. An anonymous claim is not confirmation. Yet investigators also know that major developments sometimes begin exactly this way. A phone call, a statement, a forgotten detail. A location that initially appears disconnected from everything else. For now, the most important question remains unanswered. Was the Mexico tip simply another theory added to a long list of possibilities, or did it contain information specific enough to point investigators towards something they had not previously considered? The anonymous tip quickly became one of the most talked about developments in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Yet as investigators worked to determine whether any part of the information could be verified, another issue began attracting attention. The tip did not simply claim knowledge of a possible location. According to reports, it also contained details that appeared specific enough to convince authorities the information could not be dismissed outright. That detail matters because law enforcement agencies receive countless tips during high-profile investigations. Many are vague. Many repeat rumors already circulating online. Others come from people who have no direct connection to the case at all. This one reportedly stood out. Authorities have not publicly disclosed every detail contained in the communication, but reports indicate investigators believed enough information existed to justify additional inquiry. That decision immediately sparked debate. Some observers argued the tip could represent the first major break in months. Others pointed out that unusual tips often generate headlines before ultimately leading nowhere. Both possibilities remained on the table. Now consider this. The reaction from local officials suggested the information was being taken seriously, but not accepted as fact. That distinction is important. Investigators were not announcing that Nancy had been found. They were not confirming any location. They were not declaring the mystery solved. Instead, they appeared to be following a process that investigators use in many missing person cases. First, establish whether the source is credible. Second, determine whether any part of the information can be independently verified. Third, compare the new information against everything already known about the case. Only then can authorities begin deciding whether a lead has genuine value. Viewed in isolation, the anonymous tip might seem dramatic. Placed beside the timeline, however, it becomes more significant. By the time the Mexico claim surfaced, investigators had already spent months examining witness accounts, digital records, financial information, travel possibilities, and reported sightings. Despite those efforts, major questions remained unanswered. That uncertainty created an environment where even a single credible lead could potentially alter the direction of the investigation. But something doesn't fit. If the person behind the tip truly possessed important information, why remain anonymous? That question has generated considerable discussion. There are several possible explanations. Some individuals fear retaliation. Others may worry about becoming publicly connected to a high-profile investigation. In some cases, people simply prefer to provide information without becoming involved in court proceedings or media attention. Investigators understand this reality. Anonymous information can sometimes prove accurate. At the same time, anonymous information can also be completely false. That is why verification becomes critical. Then something happened. As discussions surrounding the tip intensified, attention shifted toward Mexico itself. Why Mexico? What connection, if any, existed between Nancy and the location mentioned by the caller? Publicly available information has not established a confirmed link. Authorities have not identified any verified reason Nancy would have traveled there, nor have investigators publicly revealed evidence proving she ever entered the country. That detail matters because location-based tips generally become stronger when investigators can identify a logical connection. Without such a connection, the challenge becomes much greater. Yet investigators reportedly continued examining the possibility. Which raises another question. Were authorities reacting to the location itself, or were they reacting to specific details contained within the tip? The answer remains unclear, but experienced investigators generally focus less on dramatic claims and more on supporting information. A location alone rarely solves a case. Supporting facts do. A tip becomes valuable when independent evidence begins matching the information provided. That could include travel records, financial transactions, cell phone activity, witness accounts, surveillance footage, or other evidence unavailable to the public. Authorities have not publicly confirmed whether any such evidence exists in this case. But investigators clearly believed the information deserved attention. Now consider another aspect of the story. As media coverage expanded, public reaction became increasingly divided. Some people viewed the tip as a potential breakthrough. Others believed the timing was suspicious. Months had already passed since Nancy disappeared. Why emerge now? Why not earlier? Again, there are possible explanations. A witness may have only recently recognized the significance of something they saw. A source may have only recently decided to come forward. Information may have reached investigators through indirect channels before finally arriving in usable form. Each possibility remains speculative. Authorities have not publicly confirmed the source's identity or motivations. Still, timing remains part of the analysis. Experienced investigators often examine not only what information appears, but when it appears. Because timing sometimes reveals patterns that are otherwise easy to miss. Then something happened that further complicated the picture. The Mexico lead began intersecting with existing unanswered questions already surrounding the case. Questions about movements, questions about communications, questions about opportunities that may have existed before Nancy disappeared. By itself, the anonymous tip represented one piece of information. Combined with unresolved gaps in the timeline, however, it naturally attracted greater attention. That does not make the tip accurate, but it does explain why investigators continued examining it. At first glance, that may not seem important. Yet many major investigations have turned on information that initially appeared uncertain. Some leads collapse immediately. Others gain strength over time. The challenge is determining which category a tip belongs to before valuable resources are wasted. According to reports, authorities continued reviewing available information while attempting to separate fact from rumor. That approach reflects a basic principle of investigative work. Follow evidence, not assumptions. And at this stage, evidence remained the key issue. Not theories. Not social media speculation. Not headlines. Evidence. But something doesn't fit. While the anonymous tip generated enormous attention, another question remained unresolved. If the information was significant enough to trigger investigative interest, what exactly within the tip convinced authorities it deserved further examination? That answer has never been fully explained publicly. And until investigators reveal more about what they found, the true significance of the Mexico lead remains uncertain. What is clear is that the anonymous message did not simply disappear into a file cabinet. Authorities examined it. Officials discussed it. Resources were reportedly directed toward evaluating it. And that suggests investigators believed there was something within the information that required a closer look. The possibility that the anonymous tip contained information unknown to the public may explain why investigators devoted time and resources to examining it. But as authorities continued evaluating the lead, another issue emerged: verification. A tip can sound convincing, it can contain specific details, it can even appear credible at first glance. None of that automatically makes it true. Investigators still need evidence. That requirement has shaped every major development in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. According to publicly available information, authorities have consistently avoided making claims they could not support. Even when rumors spread rapidly online, officials generally focused on facts they could verify. The Mexico tip was no different. Reports indicate investigators examined the information carefully, but authorities stopped short of publicly confirming the claim itself. That distinction matters, because many viewers naturally assume that if investigators follow a lead, they must already believe it is accurate. In reality, investigators often pursue leads specifically because they do not yet know whether they are accurate. The purpose is to find out. Now consider this. As discussion surrounding the Mexico lead continued, some observers focused on where the information pointed. Others focused on who might have provided it. The second question may be just as important as the first. Investigators often evaluate not only the content of a tip, but also the source behind it. Did the individual have first-hand knowledge? Were they repeating information they heard from someone else? Did they provide details that could be independently confirmed? Did they have access to information unavailable to the general public? Those factors frequently determine whether a lead gains momentum or gradually fades away. Authorities have not publicly revealed answers to those questions. As a result, much of the public discussion remains centered on possibilities rather than confirmed facts. But something doesn't fit. If the anonymous source possessed information important enough to attract investigative attention, why has so little additional information emerged publicly since then? One explanation is straightforward. Investigators sometimes withhold information intentionally. Doing so can protect an ongoing investigation. It can help verify future statements from witnesses. It can prevent false confessions. And it can preserve details known only to investigators and individuals directly connected to a case. That practice is common in major investigations. Viewed in that context, the lack of public information does not necessarily mean the lead lacked value. It may simply mean authorities chose not to discuss their findings. Then something happened that continued fueling public interest. The Mexico tip became part of a larger pattern that many observers noticed throughout the investigation. Again and again, new information seemed to emerge without fully resolving the central mystery. A witness statement would generate attention. Then questions remained. A reported sighting would attract interest. Then uncertainty followed. A new lead would surface. Then investigators would continue searching for verification. The Mexico tip fit that pattern. It created new possibilities without immediately delivering clear answers. That detail matters because investigations rarely unfold in a straight line. People often imagine detectives receiving one crucial clue that suddenly solves everything. Real investigations are usually much slower. Information arrives in pieces. Some leads strengthen. Others collapse. Some remain unresolved for months or even years. Investigators must continually decide where to focus their attention while avoiding assumptions that could send them in the wrong direction. Now consider the broader picture. The anonymous tip did not exist in isolation. It entered a case already filled with unanswered questions. Questions about Nancy's final known movements. Questions about communications that occurred before she disappeared. Questions about potential opportunities that may have existed during critical periods of the timeline. The tip became important because it appeared alongside those unresolved issues, not because it automatically answered them. That distinction remains critical. Publicly available information still does not establish that Nancy was ever in Mexico. Authorities have not publicly confirmed such a finding. At the same time, investigators reportedly considered the information important enough to examine. Both statements can be true simultaneously. A lead can be worth investigating without being proven. A possibility can deserve attention without becoming a conclusion. That balance is often difficult to maintain in high-profile cases, but it remains essential. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, the central challenge remained unchanged. Separate what is known from what is suspected. Separate what can be verified from what can only be theorized, and follow the evidence wherever it leads, not where assumptions suggest it should lead. Which raises perhaps the biggest question of all. If the anonymous tip ultimately proves inaccurate, what caused someone to provide such specific information in the first place? And if portions of the tip prove accurate, how did the source obtain that knowledge? Those questions remain unanswered. Yet they continue to sit near the center of discussions surrounding this development, because regardless of where the lead ultimately points, understanding the source may reveal as much as understanding the location itself. At first glance, the Mexico tip appeared to be about geography. Over time, however, investigators may have become equally interested in the person who made the claim, who they were, what they knew, and how they knew it. Those answers remain outside the public record, but they remain relevant, because every major investigation eventually returns to the same principle. Evidence matters more than speculation, verification matters more than rumors, and facts matter more than assumptions. Based on publicly available information, authorities have not confirmed that the anonymous tip solved the Nancy Guthrie case. They have not publicly announced findings that conclusively support the claim. What they did appear to do was treat the information seriously enough to evaluate it, compare it against existing evidence, and determine whether it could help answer questions that have persisted since Nancy's disappearance. For now, many of those questions remain unresolved. The anonymous tip added another chapter to the investigation, but not necessarily the final chapter. Whether it ultimately becomes a breakthrough or simply another lead that investigators had to eliminate remains uncertain. If you've been following this case, let me know in the comments which piece of evidence you believe deserves the closest examination. Here at the evidence room, we follow the facts, examine the timeline, and track every development as investigators continue searching for answers. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future investigations.